All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Retired Warrant Officer Joe Kent, retired Lieutenant General Keith Dayton, thank you so much for being here. The way we're going to do this is I'll ask a question, and then Joe will respond first, and then we'll have Keith answer second. Does that work for you guys? Mm-hmm. So to start us off, Joe, can you talk about your background and qualifications regarding U.S. national security?
Sure. Served in the Army for a little over 20 years. Started out as an enlisted guy in Ranger Battalion, and then went to Special Forces, so I became a Green Beret. Did some time in a Special Missions unit, and then retired and went into the CIA for about a year before my late wife, Shannon, was killed in Syria.
Keith?
Joe's a real soldier. I'm something else. I'm an artilleryman by background. When I finally became a general, I did quite a few very interesting things. I was the defense attaché for the United States in Russia. I don't want to talk about this, but I looked for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That was my mission to run that. I was the U.S. security coordinator between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So if you have any questions about Gaza and Israel and Palestine, believe me, I can answer them, okay? And it's not what you're hearing about in the news. And then the final thing was, after I retired, I spent 10 and a half years as the director of what's called the George Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Germany. And while I was in that job, I was asked by Secretary of Defense Mattis to be the senior defense advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Defense. And then President Trump, for some reason, decided to nominate me to be the ambassador to Ukraine. But the election went the way it did, and that ended that particular thing. But I do know quite a bit about Ukraine. And just one other thing, Barbara, before you go. The reason why I'm here is Joe Kent came and talked to us in Tacoma about 6 or 7 months ago. I didn't know who he was. And I heard him talk. And I thought, my gosh, this guy's good. He knows everything. And I've met him a couple of times since then. Matter of fact, last time I was here in Battleground. And, it takes something to come down from Pierce County down here to do this. But it was worth my time. And I hope I'm talking to a group of friends of Joe, but boy, I'll tell you what. As a guy who served my country, I was 40 years in the Army. We need Joe Kent in Washington. There's no doubt about that. So let me enough of the paid political announcement. I'm sorry, the unpaid political. Go ahead, Mark.
Great. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on U.S. involvement in Ukraine. So for example, what led to our involvement? How do we end it? And what are the ramifications of it?
We have been encroaching on Russia's borders for quite a while. By we, I mean NATO. So obviously, if you are Russia, having a NATO presence directly on your border, it's going to be an issue. Just like if Russia and China had an alliance and they started conducting color revolutions and doing a big military buildup in Mexico City or Quebec, Canada, I think the United States of America would have something to say about that. Now, it's a long, I think, kind of complex story as to why we're so really interested in provoking some sort of a conflict with Russia. I think a lot of it ties back to the military-industrial complex, but that's kind of more ancient history. That's more background, really, than is relevant for right now. But at the end of the day, we set the conditions in a way economically, once President Trump was out of office, that Vladimir Putin, number one, had enough money in the bank to conduct a military operation. So Putin has wanted to take back areas that he thinks are part of the former USSR. If you listen to his interview with Tucker Carlson, he kind of gave a very long history lesson on why he thinks most of that is territorially Russia's. I think that's a Slavic dispute for Slavic cousins to work out. I don't think we need to get involved in dictating where those lines in the sand are. However, once Trump was out of office, Trump did something that I think that's very impressive and unique. He used our economic leverage to ensure that Vladimir Putin economically couldn't afford to invade Ukraine. So he did that by making us energy independent, which we all remember because gas cost less. So that was good for the American economy, but also because we were playing in the oil export market, natural gas export market. We were able to offer an alternative to Europe in terms of gas and oil, and that was a direct assault on Vladimir Putin's bottom line. And then also through diplomacy, Trump was able to say, hey, look, we are not interested in expanding NATO anymore. So Donald Trump is a pragmatic president. I don't think he has a strong ideology about how America needs to take over certain parts of the world and spread so-called American democracy. He's very much America first, like he says he is. And I think that gave some reassurances to Vladimir Putin and to the US and to Russia that we weren't going to continue encroaching. Biden comes in and he has to do the exact opposite of everything Trump does, kills off US energy independence for one. So automatically Biden can say he's the most Putin president in history of the world, but he gave a massive paycheck to Vladimir Putin. And Putin, once he had that money in the bank, he then said, okay, well, I'm going to see how this plays out. I'm going to see what Biden actually does as a commander in chief. We witnessed the debacle in Afghanistan, not to mention the fact that Biden was a known quantity to most of these world leaders. He had been well known for not having the ability to pretty much mess anything up, according to Barack Obama. You guys know how that quote goes. And so he saw how Afghanistan went. He had money in the bank, and I think Putin exploited that opportunity to get us to invade Ukraine. Now, obviously, Putin should have invaded Ukraine. Like, invading countries and killing people is a bad thing. However, it is a reality of the world. And if you set the conditions in a way that he has the ability to do that, it's exactly what he's going to do. Now, I think right when the conflict started, I think we had a unique opportunity in America to actually say, hey, we are going to call for a ceasefire. We're going to take a lead role in this. But instead, what we did is I think we took probably the most morally bankrupt role. And we said that we will fight Russia here until the last dead Ukrainian. We didn't say, hey, we're going to enact NATO, we're going to defend Ukraine. I'd be against that, but that at least would be a little bit more moral. What we did was we just said, hey, we'll keep funding you guys as long as you send your young men and your young women off into the charnel house to be slaughtered. We will continue to fund this and to prop this up. And then at the same time, geostrategically, we made a massive mistake. We threw a huge sanctions package at Russia. We took them off of the US dollar system. At the same time, we killed off our own, natural resources industry. So we made ourselves very weak. China then came in and exploited that gap and said, hey, we will underwrite your war. And then that gave a lot of power to the BRICS nations that were already trying to move away from the dollar. And so now here we are several years later. Every single time Washington, D.C. says the Ukrainians are about ready to start taking back land, or they're going to have some sort of an advance, that doesn't come to fruition. And we're told here again in the United States of America, with all of our problems, that a solution to Ukraine is just the next arms package away. It's just the next multi-billion dollars away. When they come back after this 2-week recess they're on, they're going to try and push through another $60 billion going to Ukraine. And here's the deal. Like, at the end of the day, that $60 billion in the next couple of months, they're going to come back and say, hey, we need a couple billion more. Because the problem is Ukraine, you can just look at a map. You don't need to know the history very well. But if you look at how big Russia is and how small Ukraine is, Russia can last in this conflict much longer than Ukraine can. So the way forward, personally, for what I think the United States of America should be doing is calling for a ceasefire, using what little leverage we have. And we're going to have to make some concessions to Russia, but I think those concessions are pretty reasonable, that we won't make Ukraine a NATO member. I think that's pretty simple to do, to say, hey, look, we have no intention of putting these guys in the NATO alliance. And then saying, look, we're not going to fund this war anymore. If we're going to give Ukraine any kind of aid, it's going to be for reconstruction. It's going to be to keep their head above water, but we're not going to fund the war and the carnage anymore. The problem is, I think Putin is in a position right now where he can look at us and kind of laugh and say, hey, I don't trust you guys. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And so, unfortunately, I think that puts him in a huge position of power right now. And in terms of what this has done strategically to the value of the dollar, I think we're in a very bad way right now.
What's your next question, Byron? Let me add a little bit to what Joe said. And Joe's absolutely spot on this, okay? I mean, I wasn't joking when I said he knows what he's talking about. What I do is I follow the war every single day, okay? I have stuff online that I can follow. What's happened in the last 2 years is an entire generation of Ukrainians have been destroyed. Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. You won't hear about that in the papers, and you won't hear about that on the news. But the reason why you won't is because we have a vested interest in keeping this war going. Why are we in this? Well, kind of as Joe said, we're in this because we see this the way to deplete Russia, okay, to basically, make them lose people and whatever, and money, and we don't really have any skin in the game except the taxpayer's dollar that goes over there. Look, I know Ukraine very well. I love Ukrainians, but Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. We don't know where our money goes to when it goes there, but we don't want to know, okay? We, meaning the administration, doesn't want to know. We don't know what our weaponry is happening to it. We don't want to know. It's a huge scandal that we have given them about $50 billion worth of weaponry, and we don't know where it went. Some of it has ended up in Africa, believe it or not, okay? If you think the Houthis are shooting things at people in the Middle East, some of that stuff came from the United States, okay? Because these are very corrupt people. President Zelensky's aide 2 months ago said people are stealing here like there's no tomorrow. And yet we continue. And Joe, I hope I'm not right on this, but I think they're going to authorize another $60 billion of aid, and it's going to go just like water into sand. But the worst part is an entire generation of Ukrainians are dead. They've lost about 250,000 young men and women, dead or severely wounded where they won't be able to work. Their economy is in shambles, never was very strong, but it's in shambles now. As Joe said, yeah, Putin's a jerk. He never should have done this, okay? There is a clear moral stand to take, but we're not taking it. We're taking the stand of throw money at the problem, talk about how virtuous we are. I agree with Joe. The way out of this for the United States, if I were the president's advisor, I would never be because I don't like this president, but if I was the president's advisor, I'd say, look, call for a ceasefire right now. You're all on your high horse about a ceasefire in Gaza. Why not here where about 500,000 people have died, okay? And they're dying every day. The war is stalemated, okay? It's trending in Russia's direction. Why? Because Russia's got all this, they know how to do this now. They've learned their lessons. The Ukrainians are putting people, I hate to say this, but people who have had no experience, you're just throwing them right into the breach, and they're losing up to 1,000 people a day, okay? Why? Because the Americans told them to, okay? One thing Joe didn't say, why are we in this in the first place? Well, Zelensky and Putin had worked out a deal in April of 2002. They were going to have a ceasefire. And Biden and Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom, who was his front man, went to Ukraine and said, don't do it. We'll fund you for anything you need for as long as it takes. Well, as long as it takes is not a strategy. And, you know, Joe covered it extremely well. Call for a ceasefire and then start peace talks now. Where's our peace envoy for Ukraine and Russia? We don't have one because we want the fighting to continue. And meanwhile, and Joe hinted at this, China is on the sidelines watching this and saying, this is just too easy. Some of you have military experience. The greatest military philosopher of all time was a guy named Lao Tzu, or Sun Tzu. And he wrote a book 2,500 years ago. And he said, the best way to defeat your enemy is without having to fire a shot. And China has managed to degrade the United States. Look, we got units up at Fort Lewis that don't have equipment to train on because it's been diverted to Ukraine. Now, Fort Lewis is targeted towards China. It's targeted toward Taiwan. And yet, it's almost criminal what this administration is doing. And I'd love to answer more questions, but Joe covered it extremely well.
Tell us about the Israel-Palestine conflict. What led to the United States involvement? Big one. What led to the United States involvement? Should we end our involvement? And if so, how?
So the history between the Israelis and the Palestinians, I won't bore you guys, they don't like each other. Now, that's to make it a very big understatement. America doesn't have our fingerprints all over that. A lot of that goes back to the post-World War I era where the British and the French decided they were going to start drawing lines all over the Middle East. The Jewish state was created. That is what it is. There's always been conflict since the state of Israel was created between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, conventional U.S., I'd say, State Department talking points or the philosophy there was that all the problems in the Middle East stem from the Israel-Palestine conflict and that there will be no separate peace in the Middle East, period, until we first address Israel and Palestine. And that basically was the conventional wisdom up until President Trump came into office. And when President Trump came into office, he put Jared Kushner in charge of this topic. And Jared Kushner has written about this extensively in his own book, but he went and said, hey, we've been trying this now, having the focal point of our policy in the Middle East being having some sort of a peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, having that be at the center of our Middle Eastern policy. What they did was they said, hey, let's take that issue and let's say we all know what we disagree on. We disagree on this very controversial topic right here. How can we isolate that? Since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when radical jihadis essentially took over the government of Iran, and they declared war basically on the West, but they also declared war on the vast majority of the Sunni Gulf states. And so what Kushner and what the Trump administration did was they came in and they said, look, you guys actually have a common enemy. Iran is an existential threat to both Israel. It's an existential threat to the oil-producing Arab Gulf countries. And so that was the genesis of the Abraham Accords. So what they did was they basically said the obvious: no one's going to solve this. At least an outsider, a Westerner, is not going to be able to come in here and say, hey, here's the grandiose solution between the Arabs and between the Palestinians and between the Israelis. Let's isolate that as much as we possibly can, and let's create a pragmatic alliance. And that's what led to a lot of the peace and prosperity that we had in the Middle East. Now, again, here comes Joe Biden. Biden comes into office, and he does, I think, two things. He brings back in a lot of folks from the Obama administration who had bet their careers in foreign policy on reaching out to Iran. That was Obama's famous thing: if you extend your hand, if you unclench your fist, we'll extend our hand. And we did that. We entered the Iran deal. We gave the Iran access to billions and billions of dollars. And what did Iran do? They funded their proxies throughout the entire Middle East. We had already seen this movie before. Biden comes in and does the exact same thing. He brings back Blinken and Sullivan and the rest of the Iran deal guys. He says, we're going to reach back out. Trump got Iran all wrong. Iran had been pretty quiet for quite a while under President Trump, but then Biden comes in, they unfreeze a ton of money, billions of dollars going to Iran immediately. Iran does what Iran does. They immediately start funding all of their proxies throughout the entire Middle East, many of whom that we're paying for as well, through the government of Iraq, through the governments of Qatar, those types of things. But the Iranians are very smart, and they said, hey, how can we upend the Abraham Accords? Because the Abraham Accords was an existential threat to Iran. It was an alliance that was created that really checked Iran. So they knew they needed to light the Israel-Palestine issue back on fire. And so they gave Hamas a bunch of aid, and then they had Hamas conduct a very brutal and very public attack. The way that Hamas immediately put that brutal attack of October 7th all over the internet as brutally as possible, I think they had a lot of professional advice from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, their special operations guys, in order to get a response from Israel. And then Israel did what they had to do. They had to go in and defend themselves. And now they're going scorched earth on Gaza. And quite frankly, a lot of people in America are not comfortable with that. A lot of Democrats aren't comfortable with that. And we can critique them here from America, where for now it's nice and safe. But they're doing what I think any rational actor would do that's faced with a threat like that. But at the same time, they are playing right into Iran's hands by putting this issue back front and center. And so now all the Gulf states, all the former allies of Israel that we had just created, now they're in a position where they worry that they're going to get Arab Spring if they don't back the Palestinians. However, at the same time, none of them want the Palestinians to come into their country. That's why Egypt actually has a wall. We can't have a wall, but Egypt gets to have a wall that we fund to keep the Palestinians out. So the solution to this, like, look, we just got to realize, I don't think anyone's going to solve the Israel-Palestine issue, but Israelis and Palestinians, two-state, whatever. I think we need to get back to isolating that as much as possible. We need to cut off all the funding going to Iran. Iran gets a ton of money from the government of Iraq. The Qataris, if the rumors are true, the Qataris offered to hand over the leadership of Hamas, and the genius Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken said, no, that's okay, hold on to the leaders of Hamas, leave them in play. There's a lot of leverage that we have if we cut off the funding for Iran and we start going specifically after the Hamas leadership, making sure that those guys are taken off the battlefield. I think that's very important, but then trying to calm down things as much as we possibly can in Israel so that this issue isn't back in the focal point anymore.
I don't know how you can listen to that and not feel this guy knows what he's talking about. A couple of other little points, though, that I think are important. I spent 5 years as the U.S. security coordinator and my job was to create a Palestinian security service that would convince Israel that they should be allowed to have a state, okay? And it worked pretty well for a while. Hamas, 1993, big date. Palestinian Authority is created in a burst of optimism and good thinking by everybody. Palestinian Authority has Gaza, and it has the West Bank, they call it, okay, the West Bank of the Jordan River, right next to Israel, okay, on both sides. Hamas arrives on the scene in the late 80s as a charitable organization. They very quickly transform themselves into a military organization, and they become very powerful in Gaza. Hamas's agenda is very clear. Death to all Jews, okay? It's what you don't hear about in the news and what these kids about, from the river to the sea and all that. Hamas is very open in what they want. They want all the Jews out. And they say, today we will go after the people of Saturday. Tomorrow we will go after the people of Sunday. Okay, Saturday, because the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. Sunday, I think you know what we're talking about here. These are people that you cannot negotiate with. They are motivated by religious zealotry, and they're organized and they're well-financed by Iran, potentially by Qatar as well, which is the silent partner in all this. Because they're so rich, they get away with everything, okay? But they're there. What do we do about this? Well, whether or not you like Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's doing the right thing. You have got to destroy Hamas as a political entity that has an army and that has territory. Once you do that, and you probably replace them with some kind of international force for a while, you can change things. But so long as Hamas survives, our administration is absolutely nuts on this. They're telling Netanyahu, you cannot attack this town of Rafah. Well, I know Rafah, I've been there, okay? And as Joe says, there's a fence, there's a wall between Rafah and Egypt, because the Egyptians don't want any of these Palestinians, okay? Nobody wants them. Why? Because most of them are Hamas sympathizers. 85% in Gaza and 80% in the West Bank are Hamas sympathizers.
What do you mean by charitable organization? How did they, when you said they started as a charitable, sorry?
They were part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is very active in Egypt and in other countries. They've been shut down in other countries, but the idea was that we'll do charity organizations, we'll do schools, we'll do mosques, we'll do madrasas, we'll teach kids, okay? Joe knows this better than I do. My point about 1993 and the Palestinian Authority is our brilliant government has said two things to the Israelis. First one is, you may not attack Rafah because there are a lot of civilians there and they'll be killed, okay? Rafah's the last place Hamas has got. They've got 4 battalions of people armed in Rafah, okay? And our administration is telling them, don't bother. Well, you can't get rid of Hamas if you do that. Let them go. And, of course, the second thing they're saying is the Palestinian Authority, which is hopelessly corrupt, inept, and don't even get me going on this. They want them to take over Gaza as soon as the Israeli army leaves. That is insane, okay? It's like putting a 3-year-old who is having tantrums every day in charge of your household. I mean, it just can't be done. But that's our administration's official position. And why? They know that Trump did something. You heard Joe talk about the Abraham Accords. Trump should have gotten the Nobel Prize for that. He should have gotten the Peace Prize. Okay? They know that's a danger to them. And yet, because of that, they're still courting Iran in their own bizarre way, this administration is. The way to get out of this, and oh, by the way, the question I think you said, Byron, should we support? Absolutely. You've got to support Israel. They've got nowhere else to go, okay? They know that. We've supported them for all these years, and we should continue to support them and not buy into this junk that these kids are doing about river to the sea and all that. That's just pure nonsense, okay? And I can get into a whole long litany of who sold the land to the Jewish people when they got there, because a lot of this land was bought by the Jews from the Arabs. They were happy. They said, we don't care. Take the land. We don't want it. All of a sudden now they want it. Anyway, this administration is totally wrong. And if you hear more about Rafah, I'm utterly convinced Israel will attack Rafah. They have no choice. It's the only sensible thing for all the reasons that Joe told you. Look, he can answer better than I can on some of this stuff because he actually was out there, got his hands dirty on this. I was doing diplomatic stuff.
Joe, you mentioned the southern border. Can you talk a little bit more about the southern border?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think most of the people have seen all the images coming out of Texas just in the last, 48 hours or so. We actually had a full-on military incursion of military edge men pushing past Texas National Guard. And that right there is just the one place where we're actually trying to defend our border. Every other border state, with the exception of Texas, it is just letting these people in. I've been to Yuma, and I've also been down to San Diego most recently, and it's very orderly, but there's a ton of people that are coming into our country. We think we've had 12 million. enter our country illegally? The bottom line is, I think we just don't simply know at all, because I didn't see any way for us to be able to count these people as they came across the border. So of that 12 million, just how many do we think intend to do us harm? I mean, we have our fingers in a lot of different places throughout the entire world. We have made a lot of people mad. There are a lot of terrorist organizations that would love to get access to America. If I was in my old line of work in special operations or as a CIA paramilitary guy, and I was a member of the Chinese MSS, if I was a member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, I would be infiltrating my operatives into our country right now. And you either give them some guidance, you give them no guidance, you give them something very specific. The sky's the limit because we don't have a border. And the crazy thing is, this isn't just because Joe Biden's old and senile. This is a controlled invasion that we're paying for. The DHS, and I've seen this happen with my own eyes, they move the people from the border, they take them to hotels where they're processed, they take them to airports, and then they're flown into major urban cities. I mean, this is the entire plot of the Democrat Party. It's a cold-blooded power play. That's all it is. They want more heads in major urban areas they can count during a census, and from there, they're going to get new legislative seats at the state and federal level. The fentanyl is another major issue. We've had, we think, 113,000 Americans get killed by fentanyl, and that's like over the course of about 18 months. That fentanyl, the precursors, the ingredients are coming from the Chinese Communist Party. The Mexican drug cartels then get them and pump them into the country, and Americans are dying left and right. Pretty much every event that I go to, I have somebody come up and tell me their personal story of how someone they love has been killed by a fentanyl overdose, because the fentanyl is being laced into pretty much any kind of drug out there. Synthetic marijuana, the black market Percocets, those types of things. People are dying from fentanyl there. And this is, again, this is unconventional warfare that's being waged against us by the Chinese Communist Party. It's the Opium Wars 2.0. So our border, I think, is our gravest national security threat. Marie Perez, as most of you guys know, and I talk about it all the time, not only did she say that nobody loses sleep at night over the southern border, she voted 10 months ago. She had an opportunity to vote 10 months ago to close down the border. H.R. 2 that the House Republicans passed is probably some of the strongest immigration legislation that we've had in probably multiple decades. And so what that would have done, just top line, it would have had us finish the wall so we could stop the flow of the illicit narcotics. But it also would have said that, hey, these people that are coming into our country illegally and claiming asylum, they can't claim asylum immediately in America. They have to go back to a third country. If you go down to the border, you're going to see most of these people, they're not running away from the Border Patrol, they're running to the Border Patrol. Because the second they say, hey, I need asylum, I need amnesty, I'm being persecuted in my country of origin, we let them into the country, and then they just disappear in the system. If they play by the system, they get up to 8 years to prove their claim inside America. So they essentially become American citizens at that point, and then we have to pay for them. And so these guys are getting tons of money from the welfare states, the federal, and at the state level. So it's a glaring national security issue. I think it could be fixed relatively easy to do legislatively, but then hard to actually implement. We've got to finish the wall. We need to have massive deportations. These people need to be tracked down. I think if we took away the ability for a lot of them to make a living here, a lot of the economic immigrants would leave because they're here for an opportunity, and that would let us concentrate our finite resources on actually running down the bad actors that are here in the country. What you saw in the last 24 hours in Russia, that could easily happen here. That should be a wake-up call to all of us. So I personally think, you got Chris Wray at the FBI right now saying, like, well, all the lights are blinking red. It's just a matter of if, not when. It's like, well, gosh, Chris, how'd that happen? I mean, maybe because the FBI was too busy running down grandmothers from January 6th as opposed to actually securing our country. So I personally think that we're in for a tragedy, unfortunately, especially if we don't take care of this quickly.
I would like to know what the congresswoman who represents this district is doing about it. And the answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. You know, I'm an old student of the Soviet Union, and I know how the Communist Party voted. And the U.S. Democrat Party is voting the same way. You notice they never, ever, ever go to the other side? You know, you got a guy sitting here next to me who's been on television and other places rather vocal about this. And he's right. And I've got a hunch that if you send Joe Kent to Washington, that he won't just sit there and be silent and, you know, just say, well, it's none of my, nobody loses sleep over it or anything like that. That's insane. But somehow this person is supposed to be representing all of you. And I find that to be very, very difficult to take. Joe said, and we talked about this just before we all sat down, what happened in Russia 2 days ago? You had a bunch of migrants, apparently from Central Asia, on the internet, and somebody offers them $5,000 apiece to go kill a bunch of people. They're in bad way. They feel alienated. They don't have any money. And oh, by the way, and part of that was, we'll give you safe passage out. We'll protect you. You can go to Ukraine. This is going to blow up, by the way. So you don't think that could happen here? Migrants down on their luck, no jobs, don't know what they're doing. Somebody offers them money to do something like this. Boy, I'll tell you, it's a disaster waiting to happen. And this administration doesn't care, and this Democrat Party doesn't care. And that's what bothers me.
I'll add to that, because I need you guys to help me out with messaging here in the district. Perez is part of the Blue Dogs, and the Blue Dogs are working with some moderate Republicans right now, and they say they have a solution to the foreign aid crisis we have and to the border crisis. And they've written this bill, and it's supposed to be the greatest bipartisan bill ever, because they say it addresses the southern border, and then it addresses Ukraine and addresses Israel-Palestine. This is nothing more than a scam to try and get her defense contractor donors money. So first off, the border portion of it that she says fixes the border, and they're saying it's more conservative because the Democrats are against Remain in Mexico. Perez says that this restores Remain in Mexico. This allows the Border Patrol to send people back over to Mexico, which sounds great until you read the very next paragraph right after the restoration of Remain in Mexico. It says, unless the migrant, using their language, unless the migrant claims amnesty. So it does not close the amnesty loophole. So Laken Riley's killer, that guy exploited him and his brother both exploited not just the amnesty loophole, but then they also exploited sanctuary cities, which Marie Perez has supported too. So when you hear people talk about this great bipartisan solution that Perez came up with, just remember that amnesty loophole doesn't get closed and the wall doesn't get finished. And it's a $66 billion bill. And guess how much money is allocated for the border? Zero. All the money goes to defense contractors. And so here's the scam. The Democrats and the Republicans, unfortunately, are going to come back in 2 weeks and they're going to say, hey, we need to pass this Ukraine supplemental. They're going to try and jam through the $95 billion that the Senate already passed. And if that doesn't work, then they're going to go with the compromise, which is going to be Perez's bill. And that's going to make them all look really, really, really good, really bipartisan. Their bill is $66 billion. So they're just going to come back in a shorter period of time and ask for more money. But just when you're out there talking to folks and the Colombian says that Marie Perez basically has the fix to the border, just know that that's a complete and total lie. And actually, if you read the bill, it's plainly spelled out in the first couple paragraphs how amnesty is restored. And then Washington, D.C., if Washington, D.C. cares about something, they fund it. There's no money allocated whatsoever for the border in that bill.
What do you think the path forward is for American national security given our debt?
Yes, that's a tough one. So personally, I think we have a huge existential crisis of how much we are in debt. And what happened in the last 24 hours in D.C. didn't help at all. We just added another at least $1.3 trillion to the national debt. Actually, if you play it out, this bill is going to blow out the budget this year to $7.5 trillion-ish. We take in just under $5 trillion in tax revenue. And that's what's driving this cycle of inflation that everybody's feeling right now. But also, as we talked about what's happening on a big picture with China eroding the status of the U.S. dollar, I think that and the border are probably the two most dire national security threats we have. The big problem that we have with how much money we spend in overseas wars and foreign aid right now, that in the post-World War II era, there's been an assumption that America will basically provide the security guarantees for everybody, that we will be the entire backbone of NATO. We will defend the entirety of Europe against Russian aggression. Us and like the Brits and I think the Polish right now are the only ones meeting our actual commitment in terms of GDP to NATO. Everybody else is free riding off us. You got Macron in France is over there talking about putting combat troops in Ukraine, which is a bright red line for war. So Macron is saying that knowing that America would be the ones that actually have to cash that check in terms of blood and treasure. So we are the ones that are supposed to back up all of NATO. Same thing with the international high seas shipping, global commerce. Our Navy provides that security as well. So when something kicks off like a crisis in the Red Sea with the Houthis, who's supposed to go bail them out? I mean, look at the Red Sea as the connector to the Suez Canal, which is the connector to the Mediterranean. It really affects European commerce. The Europeans would hardly get off their lazy butts to go defend that because they know that Uncle Sam is going to send their fleets out there to launch, $1 million Tomahawk missiles at little Houthi drones. So we are the ones that are responsible for all that. I think we've got to get much more pragmatic. Number one, first and foremost, before we spend one penny on anything overseas, our border's got to get secure. I think that's pretty much just common sense. So, but then we also really have to lean heavily on our allies. I'm not saying we withdraw from NATO. I'm not saying anything bellicose like that, but we do need to put pressure on our NATO allies and say, look, if you guys think that Russia is an existential threat, just check the map. You live a little bit closer. We're going to need you guys to pay up, pay your fair share, for your own defense, because we've got to start making hard cuts across the board, everything in terms of defense, in terms of what we spend domestically. We simply cannot continue to spend like we are spending right now. Otherwise, we're going to face a major economic downturn that's going to affect everybody's quality of life here in the United States.